Welcome, sleepy travellers, to another journey through the myths of old. Tonight, we drift into the underworld, not in fear but in curiosity, as we uncover the hidden story behind one of mythology's most mysterious love tales. What really happened when Hades fell in love with Persephone? This isn't just a tale of abduction, or of gods and goddesses in conflict. It's a story layered with longing, fate, change, and the seasons of the soul. So make yourself comfortable, take a deep breath, and let yourself drift with the gentle flow of this timeless story. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you watching from tonight? I'd love to know where this story is reaching you. Now, close your eyes or simply soften your gaze and let us begin. Before she was ever called Queen of the Underworld, Persephone was known simply as Kor. The name means maiden, and that is exactly what she was, the embodiment of innocence, untouched by sorrow or longing, wrapped in the eternal spring of her mother's love. The world she knew was a world of soft winds, wildflower, and the golden light of the sun. Her days were spent wandering meadows that hummed with life, bees weaving between blossoms, birdsong echoing through the trees, and rivers whispering secrets to the rocks below. She was never alone. Her companions were the nymphs, delicate, laughing beings of water and forest, who danced with her beneath the open skies and wove flower crowns with her in the grass. They adored her, and she adored them, but there was always a sense that Kor was different somehow. The earth seemed to bloom more brightly wherever she stepped. Flowers that had never existed before would spring up under her fingers, anemones, crocuses, and lilies that opened only when she looked at them. I loved her. Life clung to her. And then there was her mother, Demeter. Demeter, the great goddess of the harvest, watched over Kor with a love so fierce it could reshape the land. Her devotion was not passive or gentle. It was protective, even possessive. She had shaped the world for her daughter, filling it with peace, pleasure, and perfect safety. Nothing could harm Kor. Nothing could disturb the soft dream of her existence. And yet, beneath the laughter and the light, something in Kor stirred. She was a goddess, yes, but she was also a growing soul. And growth, as nature teaches, always carries tension. Sometimes, when the nymphs were asleep and the stars stretched above her like silent watchers, Kor would lie awake and wonder. She would press her hand to the warm earth and feel it pulse faintly far below. There was a rhythm down there, a heartbeat not her own, something ancient and unfamiliar. She didn't know why it called to her, she only knew it did. She began to drift away from her companions more often, walking deeper into groves where shadows clung like secrets. She found beauty in darker flowers, violets, deep red poppies, and irises the colour of twilight. Her smile grew softer. Her thoughts wandered. She began to dream of things she had no name for, places she had never seen, voices she had never heard. It was not unhappiness. It was restlessness, a sense that there was more to her than what had always been. Kor was not content to be only a daughter. The world above had offered her everything, sunlight, safety, beauty. But in the quiet spaces of her heart, she wondered what lay beyond it. She didn't fear the unknown, she longed for it. Like a seed sensing the pressure of the soil above it, she felt that her time of simply being was drawing to a close. Something within her was beginning to change, and though she couldn't explain it, not to her mother, not even to herself, she knew she was waiting for something, or perhaps for someone. She did not know that far beneath the earth, another soul was waiting too, but that is a story still unfolding. For now the maiden wandered the fields of spring, humming ancient songs, not knowing that each step she took was bringing her closer to the threshold of a new world. One not made of sunlight but of shadows, silence, and transformation. Far beneath the surface of the world, beyond the roots of mountains and the bones of the earth, lay a realm untouched by time or sunlight, the underworld. It was not a place of fire and torment, as some later imagined, but a realm of stillness, shadow, and eternal presence. Rivers flowed through it not with water, but with memory. The air did not move. The walls whispered secrets from lives long gone, and at the centre of it all, in a throne room carved from obsidian and silence, sat Hades. He was a god, but not one who sought worship or glory. Unlike his brother Zeus, who ruled the skies with thunder, or Poseidon, who stirred the seas with his trident, Hades ruled what was inevitable: death. He did not cause it. He did not crave it. He simply received it. He was not evil, though the immortals feared his name. They feared him because he reminded them of endings, of farewells, of stillness, of the great unknown. And so he became a lonely king, not by punishment, but by role. He had drawn the lot of the underworld when the cosmos was first divided among the three brothers. While the heavens blazed and the oceans roared, Hades took the realm beneath all realms, a place no one could see, and few dared speak of. His kingdom was vast, filled with winding caverns, spectral forests, and silent fields where the dead wandered like mist. It was not cruel, it was simply what came after. And in all that endless quiet, Hades reigned with solemn patience. His judges, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus, saw to the souls of the departed. His three-headed hound, Cerberus, guarded the gates. The Furies kept their eternal vigil, and Hades waited. He did not know for what. Gods are not immune to longing, even those who sit on the thrones of stone. In his youth, Hades had visited the world above. He remembered sunlight, not with desire, but with a kind of distant wonder. He remembered green hills and the scent of apple blossoms, but it was long ago, before the underworld had fully claimed him. Now he lived in the dark, and the dark lived in him. It was a loneliness deeper than absence. He had everything a king could possess: power, dominion, obedience, but none of it filled the aching quiet that bloomed in his chest like an unspoken wish. The souls of the dead did not speak to him the way the living did. They were echoes, drifting through eternity, remembering the world that had forgotten them. They could not offer him companionship. They could not challenge him, see him, or change him. He was unchanging. And yet even gods crave to be seen. Sometimes Hades would rise from his throne and walk through his kingdom unseen by the dead. He would move through fields of asphodel and watch the shades brush past him like fog. He would stand at the banks of the river Lethe, where souls came to forget their lives, and wonder what it would be like to forget his own role, to begin again, not as a ruler, but as someone ordinary, someone capable of being surprised. He watched the seasons through the eyes of the dead. They spoke of the world above, of spring returning, of flowers blooming, of lovers meeting beneath blossoming trees. Hades listened, not with envy, but with yearning. Then one day, as he stood beside the pool of reflection, a still dark surface in the heart of the underworld, he saw her, not a soul, not a shade, but a living being. Her image shimmered across the water as if by fate's accident. She was walking through a meadow, her fingers grazing the tops of tall grasses, her laughter carried by wind. She wore no crown, bore no weapons, and yet something about her stilled him completely. The light clung to her like she was made of it, but it was not her beauty that held him. It was her aliveness, her vitality, her mystery. She was the very opposite of everything he had known, and in her he sensed not just life, but this potential for transformation, not only for herself, but for him. He did not move. He barely breathed. He watched. She knelt to gather flowers, narcissus, wild roses, and soft bluebells, and for a moment she looked up toward the horizon, and though she could not see him, he felt her presence brush against his soul like a breeze in a sealed tomb. Something inside Hades shifted, not in anger, not in desire as mortals know it, but in recognition, as though a door that had been sealed for eons had opened in his heart. He felt the stirrings of a question he had never dared ask. What would it be like, not to reign, but to be chosen, not to be feared, but to be known? He turned from the pool troubled and strangely awakened. For the first time in a long, long age, he felt the press of fate, not as a decree from above, but as a quiet pull from within. He did not yet know her name, but he would learn it. And the world, both above and below, would never be the same again. It began with a glance, a moment so brief and delicate that it could have been mistaken for coincidence. And yet, in the world of gods and myths, there is no such thing. Persephone was alone that day, not entirely by design, but by something subtler, an unspoken need to wander farther than usual. The nymphs had lingered by the stream, weaving garlands and humming sweet, meaningless songs, but Persephone had followed the call of a butterfly with wings like stained glass, drifting just beyond her reach. She moved through tall grasses, her fingertips brushing the wildflowers like a gentle wind. The sun shone high, golden and warm, and the air smelled of jasmine and ripe fruit. It was the kind of afternoon that felt suspended in time. She was searching, though she wouldn't have said so aloud. Searching for what she did not know. Only that something in her chest fluttered like the butterfly before her, and no crown of daisies could still it. She came to a quiet clearing, a perfect circle of soft grass and scattered blooms, surrounded by trees that swayed with lazy grace. It was peaceful. It felt untouched, sacred in a way she couldn't name. She knelt to gather a narcissus flower, white as winter, with a centre as gold as flame, and just as she plucked it from the earth, the moment unfolded. Below her, in the vast and hidden reaches of the underworld, Hades looked up. Perhaps it was fate. Perhaps it was the work of unseen forces, Nyx weaving the night, Ananke spinning necessity, or Gaia herself, whispering between the roots of the world. Whatever the cause, Hades' gaze rose through the veils that separate the realms, through shadows and stone and silence, and it found her. The effect was immediate. Time seemed to hesitate. In that instant, everything softened around Beard. Leaves stopped rustling, birds ceased their song, and even the sun dimmed slightly, as if to frame her in gentler light. Persephone paused, unaware of the eyes that watched her from far below, but somehow feeling something, a warmth not from the sun but from within. Her hand hovered over the flower she had just picked. Her breath caught. To Hades, it was not the gaze of a god that fell upon her, but something much more human. He was not peering with the cold detachment of a ruler observing a subject. No, he looked at her the way a lonely soul looks at beauty it never imagined could touch its life. She seemed not to walk upon the earth, but to belong to it, as if the land itself had created her out of longing. She was light but not blinding. She was joy but not naive. Her presence awakened something in him that had long slumbered. Not lust, not power. Something gentler, yet more terrifying, yearning. In that glance, Hades felt the impossible. He saw not just a maiden, but a mirror. Not of his darkness, but of his absence. The quiet hunger he had buried beneath centuries of duty stirred at the sight of her. And deeper still, he felt something he had almost forgotten existed among the gods. A sense of destiny, not as command, but as invitation. He did not rise from his throne immediately. He remained still, hands resting on obsidian armrests, the flickering torches casting long shadows across the hall. His thoughts spiraled. Who was she? Why had he seen her now after all this time? And why did his heart, if such a thing still beat within him, feel as if it had been pierced by the simplest thing in the world, a girl plucking a flower? In the world above, Persephone stood upright, holding the narcissus to her chest. She closed her eyes. For a moment, a breeze passed through the clearing, a strange one, cooler than before, carrying the faintest scent of damp earth and forgotten stone. It brushed her skin and made her shiver, but not in fear. It was as if something ancient had exhaled, and she had heard it, not with her ears, but with her soul. She turned, glancing towards the tree line, sensing something, but nothing was there. Still she lingered, her thoughts no longer on flowers or butterflies. A quiet change had touched her. She didn't know it yet, but the world had begun to turn differently beneath her feet. In the days that followed, she would think of that moment. She would return to that clearing more than once, though she would not tell the nymphs why. She would pick more flowers, though none seemed quite as beautiful as the one she had gathered, or when the wind had whispered. And she would dream, strange dreams of marble halls lit by torchlight, of a voice calling her name from deep beneath the soil, of eyes like midnight watching her from beyond the veil of sleep. And Hades? He began to rise, not physically, not yet, but in his mind he no longer wandered the riverbanks or sat in silence among the dead. He thought of her, he remembered her laughter, though he'd only glimpsed her smile. He imagined her voice, though he had not yet heard it. He began to speak her name aloud once he had learned it. Persephone. A glance, they say, is nothing. But in this glance, two worlds brushed for the first time. Shadow met sunlight. Death met life. A king met a maiden. And nothing would ever be the same. The sky was soft with golden haze the day it happened. Not the sharp brilliance of summer, nor the gentle grey of autumn's edge, but something in between, a breathless stillness. Persephone was walking alone again, her basket half filled with wildflowers she had gathered with careful hands. The morning had been ordinary, like so many before it. Birds singing, bees working, the world wrapped in the fragrance of blooming life. And yet, beneath all of it, something was different. For days now, Persephone had felt the pull. She couldn't explain it, not even to herself. A subtle magnetism like the earth itself was calling to her. The same clearing she had stumbled upon before now drew her back again and again. It was quiet there in a way that felt sacred. The nymphs avoided it. Animals rarely wandered through. But Persephone, she returned, as though something invisible were waiting just beneath the surface. She knelt to the ground and began to gather more blossoms. Irises, crocuses, narcissus, the colours bleeding together in soft harmony. Her fingers moved, but her mind wandered. A breeze brushed past her cheek, cool and earthy. It did not smell like the upper world. It smelled older, deeper, like something that had been waiting for centuries to be noticed. And then it happened. There was no warning, no thunder, no tremble in the trees, just a soft shudder beneath her knees, as if the earth had exhaled. The ground split. It was not violent at first. The grass quivered, and the soil cracked in a perfect silent line, opening like a mouth from the centre of the clearing. Persephone froze, her breath caught in her throat. The basket fell from her hands, forgotten, its contents spilling in slow motion. The split widened, revealing a chasm so dark and deep that no light returned from within it. A cold wind rose from the opening, colder than anything she had felt before, and yet it did not chill her bones. It brushed her skin like fingers made of shadow. She tried to move, but her body remained still, not in fear, not in panic, in awe. From the depths a sound emerged. A distant rumble, low and ancient, like hooves on stone echoing through time itself. And then, emerging from the void, he arrived. Hades, not as a monster, not as a demon, but as a presence, tall and composed, cloaked in darkness that did not consume but surrounded him like a second skin. His eyes were the colour of obsidian and starlight, both piercing and still. There was no cruelty in them, but neither was there softness, only a weight. A gaze that saw her, not as a girl, but as something fated. He did not speak at first, nor did she. The moment suspended itself between them like a held breath stretching into eternity. The earth paused. Time curled around them. She did not scream. This is the part of the myth that has been retold in 100 different ways. Some say he snatched her against her will. Others say she ran to escape. Some speak of horror, of violence, of a girl stolen from her home. And yet, hidden within the silence of that moment, another version lies, quieter, stranger, more unsettling in its ambiguity. Because what happened between them was not force and not surrender. It was something else. something far more complex. He reached out a hand, not harshly, not commandingly, but with the gravity of a god who knew that this moment had been carved into the very bones of the world long before either of them understood it. A gesture not of possession, but of invitation. Persephone looked at him, and in that long gaze, 1,000 thoughts flickered through her mind. The warmth of the sun, her mother's voice, the scent of honey and lavender, the open fields, laughter, freedom, and yet this was not against those things. It was outside them, a path that curved into shadow, into unknown depth, into something that did not promise comfort, but offered something more terrifying, transformation. Something in her moved, not toward the safety of the surface, but toward him. The air grew heavy as she took a single step, one, and then another. She was not dragged. She was not chased. She walked, slowly, deliberately, toward the open chasm and the waiting figure below. The wind pulled her hair into long, flowing strands as the shadows welcomed her like old friends. The earth beneath her feet did not tremble. It made way. The chasm deepened, and the moment she crossed the threshold between the worlds, the cleft closed behind her. Seamless, silent, as if it had never been there at all. The clearing remained, but it was empty now. A basket of flowers lay on its side, petals wilting in the sun. Somewhere far away, Demeter paused in her tending of the fields. She felt it, the absence, a tearing in her chest like something sacred had been taken from her arms. She turned to the horizon, eyes narrowing, heart racing, though she did not yet know why. All across the earth a subtle quiet spread. Birds flew lower. Bees disappeared into hives. Crops shivered, though no wind passed through. Something had changed. And deep, deep below, Persephone stepped into a world no maiden had ever touched before. The light faded, the air cooled, the silence deepened, and in the distance the torches of the underworld flickered in welcome. The descent had begun. The earth was quiet, too quiet. The trees, once so full of bird calls and rustling leaves, now stood still, their branches unmoving in the windless air. The sun hung overhead, but it no longer radiated warmth. It simply shone, indifferent and cold. Flowers began to close their petals early. Fruits withered on the vine. Even the bees seemed confused, hovering in slow, uncertain spirals before returning to their hives without collecting nectar. Demeter felt it instantly. It was not just a mother's worry. It was a rupture in her very being. One moment she was surrounded by fields heavy with golden grain, her hands gently coaxing ripened wheat from the earth. The next, her breath caught. Her body stiffened. Her heart thundered in her chest like a warning drum. Something was missing, something sacred, something gone. She whispered her daughter's name, Kor, into the air. But the wind did not answer. The leaves did not stir. She tried again, louder this time, calling across the fields, her voice trembling with a strange fear she had never known. Kor, nothing. Panic took root. Demeter dropped her sickle. Her radiant golden gown, once adorned with harvest blossoms, faded as she rushed into the woods, her sandals pounding the earth. She went to the meadow, the one Kor favoured, the one surrounded by silent trees and the faintest lingering trace of magic. There, in the centre, she found it. An overturned basket, scattered petals, and a ring of scorched grass, barely visible, where the earth had split and healed again. Demeter knelt. She touched the ground. It was warm, too warm, as if it had recently been parted and sealed again, as if it had been used. She closed her eyes and pressed her palm flat against the soil. She could feel it now, the echo of movement far beneath the roots, the faint tremble of footsteps deep below. Her daughter had been taken, or worse, lost. Grief became fire. Demeter rose like a storm forming in human shape. The wind that had been still began to blow, sharp and cold. Leaves spiraled from the trees. Clouds gathered above her head. Wherever she walked, the grass darkened. Crops began to wither. The world, once so fertile under her gaze, began to mirror her sorrow. She searched for days, for weeks, through every mountain and valley, over rivers and through forests, across deserts and rocky shores. She questioned every nymph, every dryad, every elemental spirit. None had seen what had happened, none had dared to follow, but all could feel the change. The gods began to take notice. Olympus shimmered high above, but Demeter no longer climbed its steps. She refused to smile, refused to bring the seasons forth. She appeared before Zeus, her brother, her king, and demanded an answer. "Where is my daughter?" Zeus, who had long known more than he let on, turned his eyes away. The truth was heavy on his tongue, but he was a god of order, of balance, of unspoken arrangements. Hades was his brother, and Hades had acted not just out of love, but out of agreement. Still, Demeter was not so easily silenced. When no answer came, she made a vow. Until her daughter was returned, she would not let the world grow. No seed would sprout, no flower would bloom, no fruit would ripen. The warmth of summer would vanish, spring would be forgotten. The people of the earth would starve, and the world began to die. The rivers thinned, the winds turned sharp. Entire fields of wheat crumbled into dust. Farmers wept as they stared into barren soil. Even the animals fell silent, their eyes wide with confusion. Prayers rose like smoke across the world, not to Zeus, not to Apollo, not even to Hades, but to Demeter, to the mother of grain, the bringer of the harvest, the only one who could make the earth live again. But she would not listen, not until Kor returned. She wandered, grief-stricken and furious, clothed now in dark earthen robes. Her golden hair hung loose and tangled. Her eyes, once full of warmth, now burned with fury and despair. Mortals who crossed her path fled in terror, for her presence brought famine and sorrow wherever she stepped. And yet, within all this grief, one emotion remained stronger than the rest. Love, a mother's love, a love that could not be severed by death or shadow or distance, a love that would unravel the heavens and strip the earth bare to bring her daughter home. But in the underworld, time moved differently. Persephone, no longer Kor, was changing. She had tasted something new. She was beginning to bloom in a place without sun. And though she longed for her mother's arms, a part of her no longer feared the dark. Demeter could not feel that yet. She only felt the silence, the absence, a hollow where her daughter had once been. And the earth waited, silent, withering, until love, grief, and truth would collide, and the cycle of seasons would be born. The underworld was unlike anything Persephone had ever imagined. It was not the lifeless wasteland that the songs and stories warned of. It was quiet, yes, but not empty. Still, but not stagnant. It pulsed with a different kind of life. Slow, steady, ancient. A life that did not grow outward like a blossom, but inward like a root. She had arrived without ceremony. No torch-lit procession. No cheering crowd, no throne draped in silks. Just silence and the echo of her own breath, amplified in vast stone chambers that seemed to go on forever. Shadows flickered in corners her eyes couldn't reach. Everything here was made of memory. Bones buried in walls, secrets carried by windless air, whispers of the dead trailing like silk through long, cold halls. Hades did not touch her. He did not reach for her or bind her wrists or chain her feet. He gave her space more than she expected. In the beginning, he watched from a distance, his presence like gravity in the room, impossible to ignore, but never forced upon her. His footsteps echoed softly when he passed. His voice, when it came, was measured, deep, careful. He did not speak like a god addressing a subject, but like someone waiting to be known. Persephone said little. She wandered through the palace at her own pace, her sandals brushing across obsidian floors and halls lit by blue-green flames that did not burn. She explored rooms filled with strange beauty. Petrified forests of crystal, gardens of glowing mushrooms, vast libraries filled with scrolls written in the tongues of the dead. The air was cool and dry, heavy with mystery and 1,000 unspoken stories. It was nothing like the world she had left, and yet she wasn't afraid. In one of the inner chambers she found a small garden unlike any other in the realm. It wasn't lush, but it lived, not in defiance of the underworld, but in harmony with it. Pale white trees with silver leaves rustled in silence. Black flowers with soft violet hearts bloomed without sunlight. It was peaceful, the kind of peace that came not from joy, but from quiet surrender. She sat there often, not knowing that Hades had built it for her long before he ever saw her. And then one day he came to her with a gift. A single fruit, a pomegranate. Its skin was deep red, like old blood and rubies mixed together. He held it in both hands, not as a temptation but as a symbol. Of what, he didn't say. He offered it without words, placing it gently on the table before her and leaving the room. No pressure, no expectation, just the fruit, waiting. She stared at it for hours. She knew the stories. All goddesses did. The fruit of the underworld was sacred. Consuming it meant more than just nourishment. It meant connection, bond, belonging. To eat of it was to plant a seed within oneself that could not be removed. A thread would be tied between the soul and this place, a thread that could not be cut. And yet she was hungry, not for food, for meaning, for grounding, for something real. She thought of her mother, her meadows, the smell of crushed thyme beneath the sun. He thought of the nymphs who would be weeping now, and of the bees that no longer stirred. She thought of the open sky, and then she looked at her hands, her own hands, which now trembled not with fear, but with awareness. She had changed. The girl who had danced through fields in innocence was no longer the same. The underworld had not taken her. It had shown her something, a reflection, a mirror held in darkness. She picked up the fruit, she brought it to her lips, and she ate. Not the whole fruit, just 6 seeds, small, bitter-sweet and bursting with juice that tasted like endings and beginnings all at once. With each seed, something inside her settled, not in defeat but in clarity. She was no longer a visitor, no longer a child. She was becoming something new, something more. And deep within the walls of the underworld the realm responded. Quietly, a hum through the stones, a breath through the air. The dark did not rejoice, nor did it gloat. It recognized her. That evening Hades came to her again. His eyes rested on the empty pomegranate rind, and something unreadable passed over his face. Not triumph, not sorrow, something gentler. As if he had not expected her choice, but had hoped for it. Silently, patiently, without asking. She looked at him now not as a stranger, nor as a captor, but as someone who had waited in silence for someone to see him, and she did. He bowed his head slightly in a gesture not of dominance, but of respect, and she understood, with a calm so deep it almost frightened her. This realm was no longer a prison. It was part of her now. Not her whole story, but a chapter, a sacred chamber within her soul. The seeds had not bound her. They had awakened her. And somewhere far above, on a dying hill where crops would no longer grow, a mother screamed into the sky, her cries splitting the clouds. The daughter was no longer lost. But she was no longer the same. She was no longer Core. She was becoming Persephone. Time passed differently in the underworld. It did not march forward in neat, numbered days, nor did it swing like a pendulum between morning and night. Down here, time softened. It unfurled in long ribbons, folding in on itself, stretching and contracting like breath. Persephone was no longer counting the days. She was no longer watching for the light. She was changing. At first, the change was subtle, She carried herself differently, less like a girl searching for a path, and more like a woman who had found her footing in unfamiliar terrain. Her eyes, once wide with wonder or worry, now held depth. They saw through things, through people. She listened differently too, not just with her ears, but with something deeper, something intuitive. She had always been attuned to life above, blossoming flowers, shifting seasons, the rhythm of the harvest. But now she was learning to hear silence, to understand absence, to make peace with stillness. And the realm responded. The dead, once aimless in their wanderings, seemed to gather more closely when she passed. They did not speak, but they lingered near, as if drawn by something sacred. The torchlight seemed to glow warmer in her presence. The air grew less cold. The garden of silver trees began to bloom more fully, its blossoms lasting longer, its leaves staying brighter. Wherever she walked, some quiet grace followed. Hades noticed. He did not intrude. He watched from the edges, still careful, still reverent, but his gaze had changed. It was no longer the gaze of a king surveying his realm. It was the look of someone who had spent an eternity alone, now seeing his world not with ownership but through the eyes of another. He saw what Persephone brought, not just beauty, but balance. The underworld was no longer only a place of endings. With her there, it became something more. One evening, Persephone entered the great hall, alone, unannounced. She wore a dark gown woven from threads gifted by the fates themselves, shimmering faintly with the memory of stars. Her hair, once bound with flower crowns, now flowed freely down her back, streaked with strands the colour of midnight. She walked toward the empty throne beside Hades and sat down without asking. Not in defiance, in certainty. And the room changed. Not physically, but the energy shifted, the shadows settled, the flames steadied, the entire palace knew. She was no longer a visitor, no longer a guest. She was queen. Hades did not speak. He only inclined his head, solemnly, with something like awe in his expression. The kind of awe a man might feel standing before a wildfire he cannot tame, or a sunrise he did not expect to see again. In the days that followed, Persephone took her place among the judges. She listened to the pleas of wandering souls. She walked the halls with quiet authority. She asked questions that had not been asked in ages. What does justice look like to the forgotten? What do the restless need? Not to be punished, but to be at peace. She sat by the banks of the Lethe and spoke to souls who had forgotten everything, offering not just pity, but presence. She walked through the Elysian fields where the righteous rested and spoke to ancient heroes and poets, not as a superior, but as a companion. And she did not fear the darker corners. She visited the pit of Tartarus, not to rule with wrath, but to understand the full shape of suffering. Because Persephone, now more than ever, understood something that no other god or goddess truly grasped. That transformation did not come from light alone, that death was not just an end, it was a turning, a moment of stillness before rebirth. She had passed through the soil like a seed. She had tasted the pomegranate, and it had awakened her, not just to the underworld, but to her own soul. She no longer longed for escape. Not because she no longer loved the world above, she did, but because she had found something of herself down here, a truth she had never been allowed to touch when she was only her mother's daughter. Now she was no one's possession, no longer just the maiden, no longer just the daughter of the harvest. She was queen of the dead, but more than that, she was a bridge, a living soul who understood both growth and decay, light and shadow. She held both in her hands like a balanced scale, and in doing so she gave the underworld something it had never known before: compassion. The shades began to speak of her not in hushed whispers, but with reverence. Some called her the gentle hand, others the silent blossom. They left small offerings at the edge of her garden, stones shaped like hearts, poems scratched into bark, flowers that had somehow sprouted from bare rock. She accepted them all, and Hades, he remained at her side, not as a ruler above, but as a partner beside. Their bond grew in silence, not in thunder. They shared thoughts without words, sat in stillness together for hours. She did not fill his emptiness. She transformed it into something that could hold. There was no wedding trumpet, no divine ceremony. There was simply this truth, understood without declaration. She had become queen not by force but by becoming. And as Persephone stood one night beneath the obsidian arch of the palace sky, looking up at a single glimmering star that had pierced the underworld veil, she smiled, not because she was home, but because she had created one. There are truths that cannot be spoken, only lived. And in the deep quiet of the underworld, Persephone and Hades came to know one another, not through declarations or grand gestures, but through the slow unfolding of shared silence. In the early days, they passed like ghosts in each other's company, neither intruding, neither retreating. Hades would walk the corridors of his vast stone palace with the gravity of a shadow bound to its source, and Persephone would glide through gardens that had never known sunlight, her presence leaving behind the soft glow of something new, something still learning to bloom in the dark. At first there were no words. But words are not the only way two souls speak. He would leave books where she liked to sit, ancient texts long forgotten by the world above, stories written by hands that had long turned to dust, myths, prayers, riddles. She would read them slowly, often aloud to herself, sometimes glancing up, wondering if he could hear. He did. In turn, she began to place small things on the edges of his world. Flowers grown from ash and shadow, feathers she found in forgotten chambers, tiny stone sculptures she shaped with idle fingers. They were not gifts in the traditional sense. They were offerings of self, small signs that said, "I see ye, oh, I am here." And slowly, like roots growing toward one another beneath the surface, they met. Not with passion that ignites like flame, but with something deeper, something enduring and understanding. He would speak eventually. In the still evenings when the underworld grew even quieter than usual, Hades would come to her, not as king to subject, not even as host to guest, but as a man who had spent an eternity alone, now learning the contours of connection. He would tell her things no one else knew, that he did not love the silence because it was peaceful, but because it had been the only companion he could trust not to leave, that the souls who wandered his realm were not his to command, but his to shepherd. That ruling death was not a choice he made, but a burden he carried with dignity because someone must do it. She listened, not with pity, but with presence. And when she spoke, he listened too. She told him of the upper world, the light-soaked hills and the scent of olive trees in spring, of bees that danced through thyme blossoms, of the weight of her mother's love, so full, so consuming that she had sometimes felt like a field was expected to bloom. She spoke of laughter, yes, but also of the quiet ache that came with never being alone, yet always feeling unseen. And he understood. They began to spend time together, not as duty, but as choice. In the obsidian throne room, where the flames burned blue, they would sit without speaking for hours, content to share the air between them. In the garden of silver trees, they would walk slowly, shoulder to shoulder, brushing the leaves with fingertips and tracing constellations in the stone above. They did not touch often, but when they did, it was intentional. A hand on a forearm, a shared glance, a closeness that spoke louder than words. There was no domination between them, no chains, no forced affections. The myths that would one day be written about them, of abduction, of force, of victim and captor, missed what was essential. What grew between them was not built in a moment. It was cultivated in patience. What Hades gave her was rare in both gods and men. Space. He did not try to own her. He did not try to change her. He let her be. And Persephone, who had lived her whole life as Kore, the maiden, the blooming one, the promised daughter, had never been allowed to simply become. Her entire identity had been built upon her potential, her future, her role as a symbol of life. But here, in the land of the dead, she discovered something no one else had given her. She discovered herself, not in defiance of life, but in acceptance of death. Not in rejection of her past, but in the freedom to choose her path forward. And Hades, for all his darkness, had given her that. It was not the underworld that changed her, it was the invitation to belong to it without being devoured. She had not fallen, she had descended, and in doing so she had risen in another way. He began to smile more when she entered a room, the way his shoulders relaxed, the way his voice softened when she spoke. These were the quiet signs of devotion, and when she laughed, and yes, she did laugh in the underworld, it echoed through the halls like light breaking through cloud. They did not need to name what they were becoming. In the mortal world, love is often loud and burning, but in the underworld it was different. Here love was a still lake, dark and deep, reflecting back only what was true, and in that reflection they found something eternal, not a happily ever after, not perfection, but partnership. Two souls who had seen the worst in themselves and in each other and stayed anyway. And so the king of the dead and the queen who had once been the maiden sat side by side in their shadowy realm, not as myth, not as legend, but as two beings who had built something rare, a quiet understanding, a shared silence, a love that asked nothing, but gave everything. Above the underworld the earth was dying, crops failed, rivers ran shallow, the air grew dry and brittle. Villages that had once flourished beneath Demeter's grace now lay quiet, their fields barren and cracked. The people gathered at temples and shrines, praying desperately to gods who no longer answered, offering grain that would never grow again. And all the while Demeter walked the earth, her feet dragging through dust, her robes heavy with sorrow, her eyes hollow and searching. She had scoured every realm, questioned every god, she had even threatened Olympus itself. And finally, after much pleading and mounting desperation from gods and mortals alike, Zeus relented. He spoke the truth he had long hidden. Persephone was not gone. She was in the underworld, with Hades. Demeter did not scream, she did not rage, she simply turned and disappeared into the wilderness, and the world grew colder still. Zeus sent word to Hades. The demand was simple, return her. But by now things were no longer simple. In the underworld, Persephone stood at the edge of the river Styx, her reflection shimmering in the black water. Her eyes were calm, though her heart trembled. She knew the summons had come. She had felt it in her bones, in the sudden shift in the realm's energy, in the way Hades had grown quiet again, waiting but not pressing. He would not stop her from going, but neither could he ask her to stay. She walked to the throne room that night, the sound of her footsteps echoing like drum beats of change. Hades sat at the far end, his form still as stone, his face unreadable. But when she entered, his eyes met hers, not with expectation, not with sorrow, but with respect. No words passed between them for a long time. Finally she spoke. "I have eaten the seeds." It was not a question, it was not an apology. It was a fact. She had tasted the underworld, and in doing so bound a part of herself to it. 6 seeds, 6 small ruby-red symbols of transformation. She was no longer entirely of the world above, nor entirely of the world below. She existed between them, an in-between being, both light and dark, both maiden and queen. Zeus, seeing the consequences of his delay, the dying lands, the prayers of starving mortals, the fury of Demeter, proposed a compromise, a sacred pact. Persephone would return to her mother, to the land of the living, but only for a part of the year. For every seed she had eaten, she would spend 1 month in the underworld, 6 months above, 6 months below, a balance, a cycle, a bridge between two realms, and so it was agreed. Hades did not protest. He bowed his head in acceptance. Not because he wanted her to go, but because he understood. Love, he knew, was not possession, and Persephone, for all her grace and power, had chosen herself. That choice was what made her queen. The day of her departure, the underworld stirred in mourning. The torches burned lower, the air thickened, even the rivers flowed more slowly, as if reluctant to see her go. Hades stood at the threshold of the realm, watching her prepare to rise. He reached out, not to stop her, but to touch her hand one final time. When their fingers met, it was not a goodbye, it was a promise, and then she was gone. She rose through the layers of stone and silence, past the roots of the mountains, through the cracks in the earth. And when her foot broke the surface and touched the soil again, the world breathed. Demeter was already there. She rushed forward, arms outstretched, tears falling like rain upon scorched earth. Persephone ran to her, and mother and daughter collapsed into one another's arms, weeping not just for what had been lost, but for what had changed. Demeter wrapped her in robes of gold and kissed her brow, and the earth responded. Shoots of green burst from the soil. Buds appeared on barren branches. Streams flowed again, clean and cold. Birds returned to the sky. The sun warmed the hills once more. Spring had come, not as a season of days, but as the return of a soul. But Persephone was not the same daughter who had vanished months before. She walked differently now, spoke with a new weight in her voice. Her smile came slower, deeper. She still loved the flowers, still danced barefoot in the fields, but sometimes she would pause and turn her face to the horizon, her eyes distant, as if listening for something only she could hear. And when the time came, when the 6th month ended, she did not resist. She kissed her mother once more, touched the blossoms she had helped return to life, and descended again into the shadows, not as a victim, not as a captive, but as a queen returning to her throne. And so the cycle began. Each year she would rise and the world would bloom. Fields would turn green, rivers would swell, and joy would return to the hearts of mortals. And each year she would descend and the world would sleep. Leaves would fall, snow would cover the hills, and silence would reign. It was not punishment, it was rhythm, a divine balance, a sacred truth, life and death, light and shadow, maiden and queen, and all of it bound together by one woman who had lived both, who had become both. Persephone did not belong to one realm, she belonged to all of them, and the world turned, year after year, because of her. The stories told in the world above would reduce it to something simple, an abduction, a forced marriage, a warning whispered to daughters in spring. They would speak of a maiden stolen and a mother betrayed, of a dark god lurking beneath the earth and a love twisted into a myth of power and control. But the truth, as always, is more complex than the stories we tell to make sense of the world. Because what grew between Hades and Persephone was never about ownership, it was about transformation. In the beginning they had been opposites. He, the lord of the dead, cloaked in shadow and silence. She, the daughter of spring, radiant with life and untouched by grief. He was feared, she was adored. He ruled below, she wandered above. But between them, in the meeting of their eyes, in the weight of shared silence, something ancient stirred. Not merely desire, but recognition. Persephone had not known when she stepped into the underworld that she was stepping into herself, that what waited for her beneath the surface of the earth was not only a throne, but a mirror, one that showed her what she had always been becoming. She did not fall into darkness, she descended into truth, and Hades, he who had known the stillness of eternity, who had ruled with order but never companionship, did not find in her a prize or possession. He found in her the only thing that had ever unsettled his perfect lifeless world. Change. Love, for them, was not a spark but a steady fire. Not something that burned hot and then vanished, but something that took root. It was not the love of the young, frantic with passion. It was not the love of mythic heroes filled with drama and glory. It was a quieter thing, a deeper thing, a love forged in the patient unfolding of understanding. There were no songs written of their evenings spent together in the Garden of the Dead, no tales recorded of how he would sit and listen to her speak of the stars, or how she would bring life to places even the dead had forgotten. There were no poems written about the way she placed her hand on his when he felt the weight of eternity pressed too heavily against his shoulders. No myths about the way his presence steadied her when she began to fear her duality, that she might be too much goddess for one world and not enough for either. But these were the moments that made their love real. And through their union, something extraordinary was born. Not a child, not a kingdom, but a truth so profound it changed the way the world itself moved. That life and death are not enemies. That growth requires decay. That to bloom is also to die, and to die is also to become something new. Persephone, queen of the underworld, was not only the goddess of spring, she was the goddess of return, the embodiment of rhythm, the echo of every soul who has ever been lost and found again. Every time a leaf falls and is swept into soil, every time a seed sinks into darkness to one day rise in bloom, it is her story being retold. And Hades too changed. Through her, he came to understand that darkness need not be empty. That shadow can cradle as well as consume. He remained a ruler of the dead, yes, but no longer only of endings. Through Persephone, he became a guardian of rest, of memory, of the sacred pause before rebirth. They ruled not as tyrants, but as balance incarnate. 6 months above, 6 months below. In the world of mortals, this became the rhythm of the seasons. The world would warm, flowers would awaken, the sun would linger longer, because Persephone had returned. And then, as the days shortened and the air grew cold, she would descend once more, and the earth would sleep. But beneath that seasonal turning, something deeper pulses. The memory of a love that was not born from conquest, but from quiet courage. A love that did not fit the neat lines of myth, but grew in the spaces between them. And for those who truly listen, to the rustling leaves in fall, to the hush of snowfall, to the first crocus breaking through frost, they can still hear it. The whisper of her name, the echo of her steps between worlds. Persephone, queen of the dead, bringer of life, keeper of the in-between, and Hades, the silent god who waited, not for a victim, but for an equal. Together they remind us that love does not always shine. Sometimes it glows, it hums, it deepens. Sometimes it is born not in the light, but in the shadow. And that does not make it less divine. For in the end, their story is not one of tragedy. It is the story of becoming, of how two souls so different met in the stillness between life and death and chose to walk forward, together. Not to escape the world, but to hold it all.